There is a lake in the mountains of eastern California, and if you go there in summer it is one of the prettiest places in the state. Clear green water, pines coming right down to the shore, granite cliffs above it holding the last of the snow in their shaded folds. People swim there. Families rent boats. Cars come over the pass on the interstate a few miles away at 70 miles an hour without anybody inside them thinking very much about it at all. And somewhere near that shoreline, in the middle of the 1840s, a group of ordinary American families spent a winter that people are still talking about almost 200 years later. You've probably heard of them. Most people have heard something. The name comes up as a kind of shorthand, usually attached to one particular detail, told at parties, used as a punchline, and that detail is real, and we will not pretend otherwise tonight. But it is also, I think, the least interesting thing about them, and the fact that it is the only thing most people know has quietly buried a far stranger and far more useful story underneath it. Because here is the thing that ought to stop you. These were not desperate people. They were not fools or drifters, or the reckless poor with nothing to lose. They were among the wealthiest families to attempt the crossing that year. They had good wagons, strong oxen, plenty of provisions, hired hands, books, furniture, dress fabric, silver. One family had a wagon so large and so comfortably fitted out that the other travellers laughed at it. They left in good time. They followed a well-established route that thousands of people were travelling in exactly those years, most of them arriving perfectly safely. And then, at a specific fork in a road in what is now Wyoming, on a warm afternoon in July, they made a decision that seemed entirely sensible at the time. It was recommended in a published book. Other respectable people were considering it. There was a letter waiting for them from a man who said he would personally guide them through. Everything about it looked reasonable. That decision killed roughly half of them. That is the story tonight. Not a horror story. Something much more unsettling than that, and much more useful. The story of how a catastrophe gets built, piece by piece, out of decisions that all looked fine when people made them. Because almost nothing that went wrong for these families was dramatic on its own. It was a few days lost here, a wrong turn there, a book by a man who had never actually travelled the road he was selling, a shortcut that turned out to be longer, a quarrel, a broken axle, an early snow. Every single one of those things on its own was survivable. Any one of them removed from the sequence, and they very likely all walk out of those mountains alive and you never hear the name. That is the shape of the thing we're going to walk through tonight. Slowly, and in order, the way it actually happened to them, so you can see it building. And I want to be honest with you about the hard part, since you know it is coming, and there is no sense pretending. Yes, at the end of that winter, some of the people trapped in those mountains ate the bodies of those who had already died. That happened. It is documented. It is also, by that point in the story, so far past the edge of what any of us can really judge from a warm bed that I do not think there is very much to be gained from lingering on it. So we will not linger. I will tell you plainly when we reach it, and then we will move on, because what those people did in the last weeks is not the interesting question. The interesting question is what put them there. That question has real answers, and the answers are genuinely fascinating, and almost nobody knows them. If you are here to let a long story carry you off to sleep, then settle in. This is a good one for it. There is nothing you need to remember, and while you're still awake, I would love it if you left a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read them, and there is something I never get over in the picture of it. Someone in Melbourne with the morning coming up, someone in Manchester lying awake at 2 a.m, someone in Cairo with the city humming faintly outside. All of us moving through the same old story in the dark at completely different hours. And if these long walks through the buried side of history are your kind of thing, you might subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy them, because this is a small channel, and every single person who joins it matters more than you know. So, 1846, a town in Illinois, spring, and a group of prosperous families loading their wagons for the best decision of their lives. To understand why anyone would leave a comfortable life in Illinois and drive an ox team 2,000 miles across a continent, you have to understand what was in the air in the 1840s. And what was in the air mostly was California. Not California as we think of it. There was no gold yet. The gold discovery was still 2 years away, and when it came it would change everything and pull 100,000 people west in a single season. But in 1846, California was something quieter, and in some ways more seductive. It was a rumour of a place where the winters did not kill your livestock, and the soil did not wear out, and a man could own more land than his grandfather had ever seen. It was still Mexican territory. It was thinly settled, enormous, and by every account that made its way east, astonishingly fertile. Those accounts arrived in the form of letters, printed in local newspapers and passed hand to hand across the Midwest. Letters from people who had already gone, describing orchards and cattle and mild Decembers. Some of it was true, some of it was the ordinary exaggeration of people who have made an enormous decision and need it to have been the right one. And some of it, as we'll see, was written by men with a direct interest in getting as many Americans into California as possible, for reasons that had nothing to do with the happiness of the families reading them. The people who went were not by and large the desperate. Crossing the continent required capital. You needed wagons and teams of oxen to pull them, and enough food to last 6 months with no possibility of resupply and the ability to walk away from whatever you had built. The poor could not afford to emigrate. It was a venture for the comfortable and the ambitious, people who had done well and wanted to do better, and who could absorb the risk. Which brings us to Springfield, Illinois, and to 2 families in particular. George Donner was in his 60s, a prosperous farmer, well-liked, described by everyone who knew him as a genial and generous man. He had land, and he had done well on it, and by any reasonable measure he had no need to go anywhere. He went with his brother Jacob, and both of them brought their wives and their children, and between the 2 households they made up a substantial party on their own. George's wife Tamsin is one of the more interesting people in this entire story. She was a schoolteacher, considerably younger than her husband, educated, sharp, and curious. She was bringing books and school supplies west with the intention of starting a young ladies' seminary in California. She kept a journal. She collected plant specimens along the way. She was, in short, exactly the sort of person you would want along on a difficult journey. And her fate is one of the hardest things in the story. And then there was James Fraser Reed. Reed was a different kind of man entirely. Irish-born, ambitious, a successful furniture manufacturer and businessman, and by every account proud, in a way that other people noticed and did not always love. He had money, and he did not mind letting it show. His wife Margaret suffered from severe headaches, and part of his stated reason for going west was the hope that the climate would help her. He brought his mother-in-law, who was elderly and unwell, and his 4 children, including a bright and observant 12-year-old named Virginia, who would later write one of the most important surviving accounts of everything that happened. And Reed built himself a wagon. It has become one of the small legends of this story, and it deserves its reputation. Most emigrant wagons were plain, light, and functional, because every extra pound was a pound your oxen had to drag up a mountain. Reed's was not. It was a double-decker, entered by a door in the side with built-in bunks, a stove with a chimney running out through the canvas, cushioned seats, and space for his invalid mother-in-law to travel lying down in comfort. Other emigrants looked at it and called it the Pioneer Palace car, and they did not mean it kindly. It was enormous. It required a double team to pull. It was, in the plainest possible terms, the wrong vehicle for what they were about to attempt, and it was a very early sign of a pattern that would repeat. They left Springfield in the middle of April, in a small train of 9 wagons, and they were in an excellent mood. There are accounts of the departure. Neighbours turned out. There was a sense of adventure about it. The Donners and the Reeds were not sneaking off to escape failure. They were leaving in style, at the head of a procession, with money in hand and a plan. They joined the main flow of emigration at Independence, Missouri, which was the great jumping-off point, and there they attached themselves to a larger company for the long haul across the plains, and for the first months everything went well. Genuinely well. Better than well. This is the part that surprises people, and it is important, so let it sit with you for a moment. The first half of the journey was easy. Not easy in the sense of comfortable. It was dusty and slow and monotonous, and there were river crossings and thunderstorms and the ordinary miseries of walking beside an ox team for 10 or 12 miles a day. But it was not dangerous, and it was not unusual, and thousands of people were doing exactly the same thing that same summer along exactly the same ruts. The route they followed is the one we now call the Oregon Trail, and by 1846 it was not a wilderness path. It was closer to a highway. It was worn into the ground by years of wagons. There were established crossings, known campsites, landmarks that everyone recognized and looked forward to, places where you could expect to find grass and water. There were trading posts along the way. There were people coming the other direction with news. The great danger of that road, incidentally, was not the one you might expect. It was not attacks by the native nations, which were rare on the trail in those years, and which killed far fewer emigrants than the popular imagination has always insisted. Most of the interaction along the trail was trade. The nations of the plains sold food and horses and information to the passing wagons, and guided fords, and were generally far more interested in commerce than in conflict. The real killer on the Oregon Trail was disease, cholera above all, which could empty out a family in 2 days. After that came accidents. People fell under wagon wheels. Guns went off by mistake with astonishing frequency, because a great many men were carrying firearms in wagons over rough ground with no training whatsoever. But the Donner and Reed families had none of that. They rolled west through the spring and into the summer in good health, in good company, and on schedule. They passed the great landmarks: Courthouse Rock, Chimney Rock, that pale spire standing off the plains that every single emigrant diary mentions, because for a week or more it sits out there on the horizon growing slowly larger, and it is the first thing that tells you that you are truly somewhere else now. Scott's Bluff. They stopped at Fort Laramie in the last of June. Tamsen Donner pressed plants between the pages of a book. Virginia Reed rode her pony out ahead of the wagons in the early cool. There was singing at the fires in the evenings, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the enormous quiet of the plains underneath it all. It was, by the standards of the enterprise, a good crossing, and every one of them was at that moment about 8 weeks from a decision none of them could see coming. It is worth a moment to feel what a day on that road actually was, because we say the words wagon train, and the picture that arrives comes from a film. You did not ride. Almost nobody rode. The wagons were loaded to the canvas, and every jolt of that unsprung box went straight up your spine, so you walked, all of you, for 2,000 miles at the pace of an ox. The day began before light, with a shout or a rifle fired into the cold, and the men going out into the grey to bring in cattle that had wandered in the night. Then wood smoke, or more often the sharp, sweetish smoke of dried buffalo dung, which was all there was to burn out on the open grass and which everyone hated for about a week, and then stopped noticing. Then the groan and rattle of hitching, the creak of leather, the long complaint of animals who did not want to work. Then walking, in a haze of white dust with the sun coming up hot behind you, until noon. Then walking again until evening. At night the wagons were drawn into a circle, not against attack, which is a thing films invented, but as a corral to hold the stock. Then supper smoke rising in the blue hour, and mending and repairs, and very often music, because somebody in nearly every train had a fiddle. There was dancing on the good nights, there were weddings on that trail, and babies born on it, and both were common enough that the diaries barely pause over them, and underneath all of it was the tedium, which the diaries convey better than anything else. You could see tomorrow's landmark today, and the day after tomorrow's as well. People wore on each other in the particular grinding way that happens when the same 40 faces are the entire world for 6 months, and companies split and reformed constantly all the way across the continent over pace, and rules, and who was pulling their weight. Our families went through some of that too in the ordinary course of things. None of it mattered. What mattered was still 300 miles ahead of them, and it was not a mountain or a river or a hostile nation, it was a piece of paper. And then they came to a fork in the road, and the whole story turns on it. The place was near the Little Sandy River, in what is now western Wyoming, 200 miles or so past Fort Laramie. And here the emigrants had to decide. The established route, the one everybody used, the one that had been proved by thousands of wagons, ran northwest from there, up to Fort Hall in what is now Idaho, and then swung down and around and eventually into California by way of the Humboldt River. It was long. It was a considerable detour to the north, but every foot of it was known. People had done it. There were forts along the way and other travellers on it, and no surprises left in it worth mentioning. The other option was new. It was a shortcut, and it promised to cut a very substantial distance off the journey by going more directly west, south of the Great Salt Lake, and then across to join the main road further on. It was called the Hastings Cutoff, and to understand what happened next you need to meet the man it was named after, because he is in many ways the true author of everything that followed. His name was Lansford Warren Hastings, and he was not a villain in the ordinary sense. He was something more modern and more recognisable than that. He was a promoter. He was young, in his early 30s, a lawyer by training, ambitious in a way that had no particular shape to it except upward. He had gone west, and he had seen California, and he had come back east convinced of something that a lot of Americans were becoming convinced of in those years. California was going to change hands. It was Mexican territory, and it was thinly held, and there were not many Mexican settlers in it, and if enough Americans moved there, sooner or later the place would simply become American by weight of population. It had happened in Texas within living memory. Everybody could see how that had gone. Hastings wanted to be at the centre of that. Some accounts suggest he imagined himself as the president of a future independent California republic, and whether or not he ever said it in those words, everything he did points in that direction. He wanted Americans in California. As many as possible, as quickly as possible, and he wanted them to arrive knowing his name. So in 1845 he published a book. It was called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, and it did exactly what the title suggests. It was a practical handbook for people considering the journey west, full of advice about wagons and supplies and routes, and it was widely read because there was enormous appetite for exactly that kind of information and not much else available. And tucked into that book was a paragraph describing a shorter way to California. It suggested that rather than taking the long northern loop, emigrants might head more directly west from Fort Bridger, pass south of the Great Salt Lake, cross the country beyond it, and rejoin the main trail much further along, saving a great deal of distance and time. Now here is the thing that turns this from bad advice into something closer to a crime. At the moment, Lansford Hastings wrote that description and put it into a printed book that families would use to make life and death decisions. He had never travelled that route. Not once. He had gone to California by an entirely different way. He had never taken a wagon across the country he was describing. He did not know what was in it. He had looked at the geography, reasoned that a straight line ought to be shorter than a curve, which is true on paper and often catastrophically false on the ground, and he had written it up with the confidence of a man who had no reason to expect anyone would check. He did eventually travel a version of the route in 1846 on horseback going the other direction, in a small, fast party of experienced men. That is a completely different thing from taking families and heavy wagons and hundreds of head of livestock through the same country. A rider on a good horse can cross ground that will destroy a wagon train. He seems never to have understood the difference, or never to have wanted to. And when the emigrants of 1846 came up the trail, Hastings was out there waiting for them, at Fort Bridger and along the road, actively recruiting. He wrote letters and left them at points along the trail to be carried forward, urging people to take his route, promising to guide them himself. He was, in the plainest terms, marketing. You can see how this looks to a family standing at that fork near the Little Sandy River in July. There is a book, a real published book, by a man who has been to California. The book says there is a shorter way. There is a letter, recent, from that same man, saying he is on the road ahead and will personally lead parties through. Other emigrants are talking about it. It is the newest information available, and newer information usually is better information. And you are looking at the northern route, which everyone agrees is long, and you're already later in the season than you would like to be. And here is a chance to buy back some time. Almost everyone who reached that fork chose the old road anyway. That is worth saying clearly. The great majority of the emigration that year looked at the shortcut, thought about it, and went north. Some of them had talked to mountain men who knew the country and had been told plainly that the cut-off was a bad idea for wagons. But a group of about 20 wagons decided to try it. They elected George Donner as their captain, which is how the party got the name it has carried ever since, and on the last day of July they turned off the main road and headed for Fort Bridger. They were, at that moment, about as well off as any emigrant party on the trail. Well supplied, well equipped, well fed, in good health, with capable men and strong teams. The dust of the main road hung in the air behind them as they turned off it, and settled, and by evening there was nothing to show that they had ever gone that way. They had also just made the single worst decision available to them at that fork, and there was no way on earth for them to know it. The first sign would not arrive for another 3 weeks. When it did, it would come in the shape of a canyon. There is a question that hangs over that fork in the road, and it deserves an honest answer before we go on. Were they warned? Partly. And the partly is what makes it so painful. There was a man on the trail that summer named James Kleiman. He was a genuine mountain man, one of the most experienced travellers in the West, and he had just come east through the very country Hastings was advertising on horseback, in the company of Hastings himself. He knew exactly what was in there, and when he met the emigrants heading the other way, he told them plainly to take the regular road, that the cut-off was barely passable, that it was no route for wagons and families. He said it directly to James Reed. The two men had known each other years earlier. They had served in the same militia company in the Black Hawk War, and Kleiman told him, in as many words, to go around and not to attempt the shortcut. And Reed did not listen. According to Kleiman's later account, Reed's answer was that there was a nearer route, and it was of no use to travel so far out of the way. A straight line ought to be shorter. That is what the book said. And here was a book printed and bound against the word of one weather-beaten man in buckskin standing in the road. I do not think that was stupidity. I think it is one of the most recognisable things in the entire story. Reed was a businessman. He trusted documents and figures, and published information, the machinery of the modern world he had done well in. Kleiman was offering him something older and less legible, which was experience, and it did not come with a citation. Between an authoritative-sounding book by a man who had been to California and the say-so of an old trapper he happened to meet on the road, he chose the book. People do that constantly. People are doing it right now, and nobody in that party ever quite forgot the conversation either. It comes up again and again in the accounts written afterward, this small crossroads moment where a man they knew told them not to go, and they went anyway. They reached Fort Bridger at the beginning of August, and the first thing that went wrong was that Hastings was not there. He had already gone ahead, leading another party through the cut-off, and he had left word that anyone following should come along behind, and he would mark the way. That was not the same as a guide. That was a promise, sent backward down a road, from a man who was already busy with somebody else. They rested a few days at the fort, repaired what needed repairing, traded for supplies, and set out on the last day of July or thereabouts, into country that no wagon train had ever crossed, except the one that had gone through just ahead of them. For the first week it was fine. Rough, but fine. Then they came to the Wasatch Mountains. Now, on a map, the Wasatch looked like a modest obstacle. They are not the Rockies. They are not enormously high. What they are is broken. The route ahead of them ran through a tangle of narrow canyons choked with willow and aspen and boulders, with a creek running down the bottom of each one and steep walls on both sides. A man on horseback can pick his way through country like that without much trouble. He goes around the bad parts. A wagon cannot go around. A wagon needs a road. They followed Hastings' trail into the canyons and found that it was not passable. The party ahead of him had gotten through by a route so difficult that when the Donner Party reached the decision point, they judged it worse than cutting a new road of their own. Hastings, when they finally made contact with him, rode back part of the way, pointed vaguely at an alternative, and left again to attend to his own group. So they built a road. Understand what that means, because it is the beginning of the end, and it is almost never mentioned in the popular version. For most of the month of August, this group of farmers and businessmen and hired hands, with their wives and children waiting in the wagons behind them, went ahead on foot with axes and worked. They cut down trees, they cleared brush, they levered boulders out of the way, they dug into hillsides to make a surface a wheel could hold. In places they had to double and triple the teams to drag a single wagon up a grade, then unhitch and go back down for the next one, and do it again and again. They made, on some days, 2 miles. 2 miles. On a route they had chosen because it was supposed to be faster, it took them somewhere close to 3 weeks to get through the Wasatch. 3 weeks of the hardest physical labour most of them had ever done, in high summer, burning through their food and their strength, and, most expensively of all, their time. When they finally came down out of the mountains and saw the valley of the Great Salt Lake opening in front of them, they had gained nothing and lost nearly a month, and they were now committed. That is the psychology of it that I think most people miss. By the time it was obvious the shortcut was a disaster, going back would have cost them just as much as going forward. Every mile they had suffered for was a mile they could not bear to give up. So they went on. Anyone who has ever stayed too long in a bad situation because of what they had already put into it will recognise exactly what was happening in those wagons, and ahead of them, shimmering white and flat to the edge of sight in the August heat, was the next thing Hastings' book had described. He had given it a single reassuring sentence. He had gotten the number wrong by half. The book had told them there would be a dry stretch of about 40 miles, one long hard push, a day and a night, and then water on the other side. The actual distance across the salt desert west of the lake is closer to 80 miles. It is difficult to convey what that country is like unless you have stood in it. It is flat to the horizon in every direction, white and utterly without shade or feature. The surface looks solid. It is a crust of dried salt and mud, and in places it holds, and in places a wheel breaks through and sinks into wet grey muck underneath and stops dead. There is no water, there is no grass. The heat comes off the ground as well as down from the sky, and the light is so blinding off the white that men tied cloth across their eyes, and the air distorts until the far mountains float free of the earth and shimmer and appear to move. The only sounds out there are your own wheels, and the wind and the animals. Salt gets into every crack in your skin and every crack in your boots. At night it goes cold fast, and the stars come out over the flats with nothing at all in the way. They went out into it in the middle of a hot week at the start of September, expecting a day. It took them 5 or 6 days to get across. The oxen began to fail almost immediately because oxen are enormous animals, and they need enormous quantities of water, and there was none. The animals grew wild with thirst. Wagons bogged down in the soft ground and had to be abandoned where they stood. Families walked. Men went ahead with the surviving cattle to try to reach water and bring some back. Some of the loose stock stampeded off into the desert in the night, maddened, and were never recovered. James Reed lost almost everything out there. He had gone ahead to find water, and while he was gone, his teamsters unhitched his oxen and drove them toward the springs, and the animals scattered and ran and were lost. His great double-decker wagon, the Pioneer Palace car that everyone had laughed at, sat out in the salt flat with no team on earth to pull it. He had to cache what he could not carry, bury the furniture and the goods in the ground and walk away from them, and borrow oxen from other families to get his people out. The man who had started the journey as the wealthiest in the company came off that desert with nothing much left but his family and what he could borrow. When they finally reassembled on the far side at the springs at the base of the mountains, they counted what the shortcut had cost them so far. Roughly a month lost in the Wasatch, something close to a week in the desert, dozens of oxen dead or gone, several wagons abandoned, food supplies badly depleted because they had been eating the whole time and gaining nothing. And the season, the thing that mattered more than any of it, had moved on without them. It was September. They were still hundreds of miles from the Sierra Nevada. And they knew it. That is the part that must have been unbearable. They took an inventory of provisions at that point and understood clearly that they did not have enough to reach California. 2 men volunteered to ride ahead, alone, all the way to the settlements to bring back supplies. Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon. Stanton was a bachelor with no family in the party at all. He had no obligation to anybody. Remember his name. The party then turned north to rejoin the main trail, and here is the number that ought to be written on Lansford Hastings' headstone. The Hastings cut-off, the shortcut, the route that was supposed to save them so much distance saved them nothing. Modern measurement puts it at roughly the same length as the established road, and by some reckonings longer. Every day of that suffering had brought them precisely nothing except the loss of a month. They rejoined the old trail in the last days of September, in country they should have reached in August, with weakened animals, reduced supplies, and a group of people who were no longer the cheerful company that had left Illinois in the spring. Because something else had been happening out there, quietly, all through the salt and the heat. Something that had nothing to do with geography. The party had begun to come apart, and within 2 weeks one of them would kill another. 20 or so families had set out from that fork as a single company under an elected captain. What crawled back onto the main trail at the end of September was not really a company anymore. It was a collection of households who happened to be travelling in the same direction, watching each other's food supplies. You can trace it in the diaries and the later accounts. Early on there is a great deal of we. Later there is a great deal of they. Wagons began to string out over miles of road instead of moving together. Families who had helped each other in the Wasatch began to calculate more carefully what they could spare. The men who had lost their oxen in the desert were dependent on the men who had not, and dependence between neighbours is a corrosive thing when everyone is frightened. And on an afternoon in early October, on a sandy hill along the Humboldt River, it broke open. The details are disputed because everyone who described it afterward had an interest in the outcome. What is not disputed is the shape of it. The wagons were struggling up a bad slope and had to double their teams. There was a tangle. A young teamster named John Snyder, working for one of the other families, began beating the oxen with the butt of his whip. James Reed objected. There were words. Snyder struck Reed with the whip handle, hard across the head. Reed's wife ran between them and Snyder struck her too, or struck at her, depending on whose account you take. Reed, bleeding, pulled a knife and stabbed him. Snyder died within minutes. Reed was, by most sober reconstructions, defending himself and his wife against a much younger and stronger man who had just hit both of them. But Reed was also the most disliked man in the company. He was proud. He had been right too often. He had that palace wagon. He was the man who had argued most forcefully for the Hastings cut-off in the first place, and everyone in that party knew it, and everyone was standing in the ruin of that decision. They wanted to hang him. Some of them argued for it openly. What they settled on instead was banishment. James Reed was to be sent out of the company, alone, without provisions, into the desert. Away from his wife, away from his 4 children, away from the sick mother-in-law who would not survive much longer. He was to ride ahead or die, and either way the company would be rid of him. His daughter Virginia, 12 years old, slipped out of camp and brought him a rifle and some food. She would write about it later. And here is the strange thing, the thing that makes this story so much more complicated than a simple morality tale. That banishment, which was cruel and probably unjust and was certainly meant as a punishment, is very likely the reason that anyone in the Reed family lived. Because James Reed rode west, alone, ahead of the party. He got over the mountains before they closed. He reached California, and from the moment he arrived he did nothing else but try to get back to his family, hammering on every door in the settlements for men and mules and supplies, driven by a combination of love and guilt and pride that would not let him rest. The company had thrown their most determined man over the pass and into the one position where he could actually save them. They did not know they had done it. It would be 4 months before any of them found out. Meanwhile, the party ground on down the Humboldt and things got worse. An elderly man named Hardcoop, travelling with another family, could no longer keep up. He was old, his feet were failing, and the wagons would not carry him. He was left behind on the trail. Some of the men refused to go back for him. He died out there alone, and everyone in that company knew it was happening while it happened, and it was not the last time this group would face a decision about who could be carried and who could not. They were also losing cattle steadily now to the Paiute people whose country they were passing through, who had watched wagon trains come through their land for years taking grass and water and game, and who took livestock in return. Every ox lost was a wagon that could not move, and a store of food that would not exist later. And ahead of them, closer every day, was the last obstacle, the wall, the Sierra Nevada. There is a moment in this story that I find harder to sit with than almost any other, and it is not the one you would expect. It is a moment of pure, ordinary human tiredness. In the middle of October, out on the Truckee River, the party got a piece of extraordinary luck. Charles Stanton came back. Remember him. The bachelor with no family in the company, who had ridden ahead in September to fetch supplies. He had made it all the way to Sutter's Fort in California. He had gotten what he went for, and then, having every reason in the world to stay in a warm valley with a full belly, he turned around and rode back into the mountains, alone except for 2 Miwok men from the fort, Luis and Salvador, leading 7 mules loaded with flour and dried beef. He did not have to do that. Nobody out there was his. He came back anyway, and he found them, and he handed over the food. He also brought news, and the news was good. He had crossed the pass twice now. It was open. There was no snow to speak of. Sutter had told him that the mountains usually did not close until the middle of November, sometimes later. They had time. Not much, but enough if they moved. They were, at that point, perhaps 4 or 5 days of hard travel from the summit. And they stopped. Not all at once, and not out of stupidity. They stopped because they were exhausted in a way that is difficult to imagine from a bed. They had been walking for 6 months. They had cut a road through a mountain range with axes. They had crossed 80 miles of salt desert. They had buried people. They had banished a man and left an old man to die, and watched their animals be driven off in the night. The cattle were failing and needed grass. The people were failing and needed rest. There was a good meadow with feed for the stock at the base of the mountains, and there was food in their wagons again for the first time in weeks, and the weather was fine. They rested for a few days. It is the smallest decision in this entire story, and it is the one that killed them. Different families made slightly different choices in those days, and they strung out along the last stretch of road, some pushing on toward the pass, some lingering. The Donner brothers' wagons fell behind the rest after a broken axle, and they made their camp several miles back down the trail at a place called Alder Creek, which is why the party would spend the winter split into two groups that could barely reach each other. Then, at the end of October, weeks earlier than anyone had any right to expect, it began to snow. Not a dusting. It came down out of a low grey sky in silence, and it did not stop. It came down for days, filling the meadow, weighing the pine branches until they cracked, burying the trail behind them, and the trail ahead of them, and every landmark they had been steering by, until there was nothing out there but white and the black trunks of trees and the sound of their own animals. When the forward group made their attempt at the pass, they found the snow already several feet deep and getting deeper, the road gone, the way ahead a white blank. They tried. There is an account of them getting to within a few miles of the summit, close enough to see the notch in the ridge, and being turned back by drifts the oxen could not push through, and a storm that came down on them in the dark. They went back to the lake to wait for the weather to break, and it did not break. That was the winter of 1846 into 1847, and it was one of the heaviest anyone in that country could remember. The snow at the pass would eventually reach depths measured not in feet but in yards. The mountains had closed. Roughly 81 people were on the wrong side of them, in two camps, with almost no food. And that is where they stayed for 4 months. If you take nothing else from tonight, take the arithmetic of that. They missed the pass by a matter of days, perhaps a week. Somewhere between 3 and 6 days of travel, that is all, and every single one of those days had been spent somewhere behind them, in the Wasatch, cutting road, in the salt desert, walking, waiting at the base of the mountains for cattle to graze. The month that Lansford Hastings' paragraph cost them was the month they needed. Let us look at what they actually built, because the popular version tends to skip straight from the snow to the horror, and in between there were 4 months of people trying very hard to stay alive in an ordinary, stubborn human way. At the lake, there was already a small cabin standing, put up 2 years earlier by an earlier party that had been caught in the same place and had gotten out. Families crowded into it. They threw up 2 more shelters nearby, rough things of pine logs and hides and canvas, with roofs that leaked and floors of dirt that turned to mud. 3 structures for something over 60 people. 6 or 7 miles back at Alder Creek, the Donner families had no time and no proper tools left, so they made do with what amounted to lean-tos, Russian quilts and wagon canvas stretched over frames banked with snow. That is what a family of children lived in from November to March in a Sierra winter. It is worth staying at Alder Creek a moment longer, because the Donner families, the ones the whole party is named after, had by far the worst of it, and are the least written about. They were 6 or 7 miles from the lake camp. In summer that is a walk of 2 hours. In that winter it was effectively another country. A person deep in starvation, in snow over their head, cannot reliably make that crossing, and people who tried sometimes did not arrive. So the 2 camps spent 4 months barely able to reach each other, each one only vaguely aware of how the other was doing, sharing nothing. And at Alder Creek there were no cabins at all. They had been caught in the open with no time to build. What they made were tents of a sort, wagon canvas and quilts and buffalo robes thrown over a frame of poles pitched against the trunk of a large pine and banked with brush and snow. That is all. In one of them lived George Donner's family. In another lived Jacob Donner's. In a third some of the teamsters. 21 people in total, more than half of them children, and among them several infants and toddlers. Snow does insulate, which is the only mercy in it. A shelter buried under several feet of snow with a fire going, and bodies inside it will hold a temperature above freezing. But the melt runs down. Everything was perpetually wet. The floors were mud. When the fire burned, it sank a pit into the snow beneath, and the shelter had to be dug out around it, over and over all winter. Jacob Donner died early, in December. So did several of the hired men. George Donner had cut his hand back in the desert, while repairing a wagon, a small wound. The sort of thing that heals in a week when you are well fed and warm. He was neither, and it did not heal, and the infection worked its way up his arm across the whole of that winter, while his wife nursed him in a canvas tent under the snow. The snow kept coming. It came in storms that lasted days at a time, and between the storms the sky went hard and clear, and the cold came down like a weight. It piled up around the cabins until the doorways were tunnels and people cut steps up through it to get out. Eventually it was over the roof lines, and a person standing on the surface would see only a few chimneys and thin smoke going straight up in the still air and the trampled hollows where the doors had been. Inside, the light came green and dim through snow packed against the hide windows, and it smelled of smoke and wet leather and too many people, and you could hear the fire and the children and very little else. Sound does not travel in country like that. The silence outside those cabins was total. They killed the remaining cattle early, before the animals starved to death or wandered off, and stacked the meat in the snow to freeze. It was not much. These were animals that had walked 2,000 miles and crossed a salt desert. There was very little on them, and then they waited and did the small things people do. Patrick Breen kept a diary. It is one of the most remarkable documents in American history, and not because it is dramatic. It is remarkable because it is so plain. Day after day, in a few lines, he recorded the weather, and whether it snowed, and who was sick, and who had died, and prayers, and the ordinary business of endurance. There is no self-pity in it. There is very little emotion of any kind. It reads like a man holding on to the habit of writing because the habit itself is a kind of order. They tried everything to find food. They hunted and found almost nothing, because game leaves that country in winter. They fished in the lake through the ice, and caught essentially nothing. They set out lines and traps. They took the hides that were serving as roofs and walls and boiled them for days into a foul glue that could be eaten. They boiled bones over and over until they crumbled. They ate mice that came into the cabins. Eventually they were eating the leather of their own shoes and harness. There were children in those cabins. That is the detail that never leaves me. More than half the people trapped in the mountains were under 18. Small children, spending a winter in the dark under the snow, being told stories by mothers who were quietly starving themselves to keep the food going into the little ones. That happened repeatedly, and it is why the death pattern in this story runs the way it does. Because here is something the arithmetic shows very clearly, and it is one of the most interesting things in the whole account. The people who died first were overwhelmingly the men. Grown men in their prime, the strongest people in the camp, died at far higher rates and far earlier than the women and children did. There are good reasons for it, and they overturn a lot of assumptions. Men have more muscle mass to maintain and burn through their reserves faster. Women carry proportionally more body fat, which is precisely the fuel you need in a long starvation, and they conserve heat somewhat better. And on top of the biology, the men were doing the heavy work, hauling wood, hunting, trying to break trail, spending calories they could not replace, and they were often the ones giving their portions away. Whatever else this story is, it is a very stark demonstration that endurance is not the same thing as strength. By the middle of December, people had begun to die, and a group of them looked at the mountains and did the arithmetic and decided that waiting was simply a slower way of dying. 15 of them were about to walk out into that snow on purpose. 7 would come back down the other side, and they called themselves the Forlorn Hope. Somebody in that group had a sense of language, and possibly a sense of humour, because the name is exactly right. It was an old military term for the party sent first into a breach, the ones expected not to come back. 15 people set out from the lake camp in the middle of December on homemade snowshoes, oxbows strung with hide, made in the cabins by a man who had once been a wagon maker. 10 men and 5 women. Most of them were young, some were leaving children behind in the cabins, on the theory that the only way to get those children out was to bring help back. Charles Stanton went with them, and so did Luis and Salvador, the 2 Miwok men who had come over the mountain with the relief mules and had now been trapped by a winter that was not theirs, and a decision that was not theirs either. They took 6 days of rations. It took them 33 days. Here is where I want to be careful and quick. That journey is the darkest part of this story. They got over the pass and into a wilderness of frozen ridges and canyons with no trail and no landmarks they could read. Storms pinned them down. Their food ran out almost immediately. Stanton, snow-blind and failing, sat down beside a fire one morning and told the others to go on without him, and they did, and he died there. Some of the party froze to death in a blizzard huddled under blankets. And after weeks without food, the survivors ate the bodies of the ones who had died. They cut what they took and marked it so that no one would be given a relative to eat. I'm going to leave it there, because you know it happened, and because piling detail onto it does nothing for anyone. These were people at week 4 of a starvation march in the mountains in January, most of them frostbitten past use, some of them barely conscious. There is no judgment I am able to offer from where I am sitting, and I do not think there is one worth making. 2 things about that party do deserve saying plainly, though. The first is that Luis and Salvador, the 2 Miwok men, refused to take part. They had come voluntarily into the mountains to bring food to strangers. They would not do this. So they left the group and went ahead alone. They were later found by the others, starving and unable to move, and they were killed, deliberately, by a member of the party. They are, by any honest accounting, the 2 people in this entire story who were the most straightforwardly murdered, and they were the 2 who had come to help. Their names deserve to be said out loud more often than they are. The second thing is who came out alive. 15 people set out. 7 arrived. 5 of the 7 were women. Every one of the 5 women who left the lake camp on that march survived it. 8 of the 10 men did not. They came down out of the mountains in the middle of January, more than a month after they left, and staggered into a Miwok village in the foothills. The people there fed them acorn bread and helped them, and carried the ones who could not walk, and got them to a ranch in the valley. That is the second time in this story that native people saved the lives of the emigrants, who had come uninvited through their country, and it will not be the last. And the moment the first of them could talk, the alarm went out into the settlements of California. There were people still alive in the mountains. There were children up there. Down in the valley, James Reed had been trying to organise a rescue for weeks, and running into an obstacle nobody in the story could have predicted. There was a war on. The United States and Mexico were fighting over California right at that moment, and every able man and every mule and every scrap of supply in the province had been pulled into it. Reed had actually been serving in it himself, partly because it was the only way to get anyone in authority to listen to him. Now the news arrived and it broke the logjam. Money was raised by public subscription. Volunteers came forward, ordinary men who agreed to walk into a Sierra winter for a wage and for the obvious reason. And in the middle of February the first relief party started up into the snow. They had no idea what they would find up there. Nobody had heard a word from those camps in 3 months. 4 separate relief parties went up into those mountains between the middle of February and the middle of April. 4. That number surprises people, because the popular version tends to imagine a single dramatic rescue, and it was nothing like that. It was a slow, grinding, months-long operation carried out in stages by men on foot, and each one of them was its own small ordeal. Understand the problem they faced. There were no roads and no trail, only snow that in places was 20 feet deep, and more. Nothing could be brought up on wheels or on animals. Every ounce of food that reached those camps was carried on a man's back, over a mountain pass on snowshoes, and every ounce he carried he also had to eat on the way. The mathematics of it are brutal. A man can only carry so much, and the further he goes, the more of it he consumes, and the return trip has to be provisioned too, and there would be people on that return trip who could not walk on their own. The first relief reached the lake camp on the 19th of February. 7 men. There are accounts of that moment, and they are among the strangest in the whole record. The men came over the last rise in the flat evening light and saw nothing at all. No cabins, no people, no smoke worth the name. Just a white field with a few dark stains on it and some holes in the surface, and the lake beyond it frozen and grey. For a moment they must have thought they had come too late for every one of them. One of them called out, and a woman climbed slowly up out of a pit in the snow and stood there looking at them, and asked whether they had come from California or from heaven. They gave out what food they could, and started back down almost immediately with the people who were strong enough to walk, mostly children. 23 of them set out. Some of the smallest could not manage it and had to be sent back to the cabins to wait for the next party. 2 died on the way over. The second relief came up behind them, and James Reed was leading it, and this is the part of his story that redeems a great deal. He had been banished from that company in the desert in October, left with nothing. And in the last days of February he walked back over the Sierra Nevada in winter, carrying food on his back to the people who had thrown him out, and he found his wife and his children alive in the snow. His daughter Virginia later described the reunion in a letter, and it is one of the few passages in this whole account that is simply and uncomplicatedly good. Reed got a group of them out and then was caught in the open by a storm on the way down. A storm so violent that his party had to dig a pit in the snow and huddle in it for days while their fire sank and the wind came over the top of them. People died in that hole. A child died in her father's arms. And when it finally cleared, Reed and the others walked on and carried out the ones they could carry. That pit in the snow deserves a moment of its own, because it is one of the least known and most harrowing episodes in the whole account, and it happened to the rescuers. Reed's party had come out of the lake camp with a group of survivors, mostly children, some of them being carried. They were partway down the mountains when the storm caught them in the open. There was no shelter anywhere. They stamped down a platform in the snow, built a fire on it, and settled in to wait. The trouble with a fire built on snow is that it melts its way down. Over the days of that storm, the fire sank into a pit, and the pit deepened until the people were in a well of snow 20 feet or more deep, with the fire at the bottom and the wind roaring across the top. The great pine they had lit the fire against eventually burned through, and the branches came down on them. They ran out of food entirely. The men who were supposed to be the strong ones were snowblind and frostbitten and could not manage the fire. One of the rescuers kept it alive almost single-handedly for days. People died in that hole. Reed's own party could not go on and could not go back, and when it finally cleared, some of them were carried out, and some of them were left with a little wood and what food could be spared to wait for the next party coming up behind. That place is called the Starved Camp in the accounts, and a family with small children survived there for over a week after the rescuers had gone on, in a snow pit with nothing. They came out. All the children of that family came out, their mother got them through it. The third relief came up in March, the fourth in April, and by then it was less a rescue than a recovery. Not everyone left when they could have. This is one of the details that lodges in you. Tamsin Donner, the school teacher, the one with the plant collection and the plans for a seminary, was strong enough to walk out with the third relief. Her children were sent down. She stayed because her husband George was dying slowly of an infected wound in a hand he had cut weeks before, and she would not leave him alone in a shelter under the snow to die by himself. She stayed with him until he died, and then she started for the lake camp alone, and she did not survive the winter. She was, by every account of everyone who knew her, one of the best people in that entire company. By the middle of April it was over. Of the roughly 87 people who had turned onto the Hastings cutoff at that fork in the road, somewhere around 48 came out of the mountains alive. Just about half. And the pattern of who lived holds all the way through. Families who stayed together and who had women and children in them did best. The Breens, who had a large family and stayed together in the cabin, and had Patrick's stubborn diary-keeping habit, and his equally stubborn refusal to give up came through without losing a single person. The Reeds, remarkably, all survived, every one of them, largely because of a banishment that was meant as a punishment. The people who did worst were the single young men travelling alone, the hired hands, the teamsters, the men with no family in the party. They had nobody to keep alive for and nobody keeping them alive, and they died at rates far higher than anyone else. There is a lesson in that which I will not overwork, but it is there, and it is one of the more genuinely useful things this whole terrible episode has to tell us. So what happened to everyone afterward? Some of them did extremely well. One of them was destroyed by it for the rest of his life. And the man who caused all of it walked away without a scratch. The survivors came down into a California that was in the middle of becoming American, and within a year and a half of their ordeal, gold was found at a sawmill not very far from where they had ended their journey. The place they had suffered so much to reach became, almost immediately, the most talked about destination on Earth. There is something almost unbearable about the timing of it. They were early by 18 months. If they had waited a year and gone in 48 with the rush, they would have travelled a better-known road with far more traffic and help on it. James Reed, the banished man, did extremely well. He settled in San Jose, prospered in the gold years, dealt in land, became a person of standing. He had walked back into the mountains for his family and gotten every one of them out, and whatever the company had thought of him in that desert, history has been kinder. Virginia Reed, the 12-year-old who slipped her father a rifle in the dark, grew up, married, lived a long life, and wrote about all of it. Her letter to her cousin back east, written a few months after the rescue, is one of the great primary documents of the American West, written by a girl of 13 who had just been through something no one should go through. Near the end of it, she gives her cousin some advice about travelling to California, and the advice is essentially this. Come as fast as you can and do not take any shortcuts, and never stop to rest. The Breen family, who had come through intact, settled in San Juan Bautista and lived out ordinary and prosperous lives. Patrick's diary was published and became the backbone of every account written since. Louis Kieseberg, the last man brought out of the mountains, spent the rest of his life being pointed at. He had been found alone in the camp in April in circumstances that horrified the men who found him, and he became the figure the public fixed on, the one they could make into a monster so that everyone else could be a victim. He was accused of murder and theft. He sued for defamation and technically won, and was awarded a token amount, and it did him no good at all. He tried business after business and they failed. He lived a long time and died poor and hated. Whether he deserved all of it, some of it, or very little of it, is genuinely unclear even now. And the honest historical answer is that we do not know, and that the people who were most certain about it were the ones who had not been there. And Lansford Hastings, the promoter, the man whose paragraph in a book turned that fork in the road into a trap, went on with his life. He was in California during those very months, and he suffered no consequences worth mentioning. He continued to promote schemes. Later he tried to organise a colony of Confederate exiles in Brazil after the American Civil War, and died at sea on that errand. He never, so far as anyone can establish, expressed serious regret. He had written a book, and other people had made their own choices, and that was that. Something should be said about the children, because they were the majority of the people in those mountains, and they are almost always background in the telling. More than half of the party were under 18. Some were infants. One of the youngest to be brought out was barely a year old, carried down over the pass in a blanket on a man's back. There were children who lost both parents that winter, and came down into a strange country as orphans, to be taken in by families in the valley, or by relatives who had gone west earlier. Several of them lived a very long time. That is a strange thing to sit with. There were survivors of that winter still alive in the 1920s, elderly people who had been small children in a cabin under the snow, who lived to see automobiles and telephones and the beginning of aviation. One of them, taken out as a small child, lived into her 90s. They gave interviews. They were photographed as respectable old people in high collars, and somewhere behind the eyes was a winter that nobody else in the room could imagine. And the practical consequences of what happened to them were real and immediate. The story went east fast, and the next season's emigrants read it. The lesson everybody drew was the correct one, and it was drawn in the plainest possible terms. Do not take unproven shortcuts. Start early. Do not linger. Get over the Sierra Nevada before November, whatever else you do. The Hastings cut-off was essentially finished as a wagon route. A few parties used pieces of it afterward, and it had one long, strange afterlife, because the road the Donner Party cut with such agony through the Wasatch was used the following year by the Mormon migration coming into the Salt Lake Valley. Those 3 weeks of axe work were not entirely wasted. They just did not benefit the people who did them. The pass where they failed to cross is named after them now. The lake is named after them. There is a monument at the site of one of the cabins, and the height of its pedestal was set deliberately to match the depth of the snow that winter. It is 22 feet. There is something worth understanding about how this story got told, because the telling is part of why you know the name at all. The newspapers got hold of it almost immediately. A California paper ran an account within weeks of the last rescue, and it was picked up and reprinted across the country, and the emphasis was exactly where you would expect a newspaper to put it. Not on the shortcut, not on the book. On the last 3 weeks in the cabins, described in the most lurid terms the writer could manage, some of it invented outright. That is the version that went east. That is the version that got into the culture and set like concrete. Within a year of the survivors walking out, the thing they were famous for was already fixed, and it was the worst thing, and it would never move again. The survivors spent the rest of their lives inside that. Some of them refused to speak about it at all. Some gave interviews for decades, correcting details, disputing each other, defending their families. They argued in print about who had done what, and about who had behaved well, and the arguments went on into the 1890s, half a century later, when the last of them were old and the rest were dead. Virginia Reed was still writing about it as an elderly woman. There were reunions. There were also feuds that never healed. And the reason the story stuck, I think, has less to do with the horror than people assume. Plenty of terrible things happened on that trail. Whole families were wiped out by cholera without anyone remembering their names. What made this one lodge was that it was so close to ordinary. These were middle-class families with furniture and books and school teachers among them. They were not doing anything unusual. They were doing exactly what thousands of respectable people were doing that same summer, and they made one plausible decision at a fork in a road, and the ground opened underneath them. That is much more frightening than a story about people who took wild risks. It suggests that the distance between a normal life and a catastrophe can be a single reasonable choice, made on good information that happens to be wrong. Now let me come back to the thing I said at the beginning, because we are near the end of the night and this is what I actually want to leave you with. We remember these families for the wrong reason. We remember them for the last 3 weeks, and the last 3 weeks are not the story. The story is the 8 months before them, and the story is a sequence of decisions that were not crazy. Look at how it actually went. A man wrote a book to promote a route he had never travelled, for reasons of his own ambition. A group of intelligent, well-equipped families read that book, at a fork in the road, under time pressure, and chose the newest available information over the oldest. They were then trapped by a very human thing, which is that once you have suffered enormously for a choice, going back feels like admitting the suffering was for nothing, so you go forward instead. They lost a month. They arrived at the last mountain range in the last week the weather would allow. They were exhausted, so they rested for a few days, which any of us would have done. And the snow came early. Take away any single one of those pieces and they all get through. If the book does not exist, they take the northern road and arrive safely in October. If the Wasatch has a usable trail, they save 3 weeks. If the desert is 40 miles as promised instead of 80, they keep their oxen. If the snow arrives on its normal schedule in the middle of November, they walk over that pass without ever knowing how close it was. That is what disasters are usually made of. Not one catastrophic error, but a chain of small reasonable ones, each of which narrows the space for the next, until finally there is no room left and the weather decides. There is one more thing worth saying, and then I will let you go to sleep. The people who came through that winter did not come through it because they were the toughest. That is worth repeating, because it runs against everything the popular telling implies. The strongest men in the camp died first. The people who lived were the ones who were part of something, families who stayed together, mothers who had a reason to keep going that was not themselves, children who were being carried by somebody. The Breens, all 9 of them, huddled in one cabin, praying together every evening because the father insisted on it, arguing, doing the small stubborn work of a household in a hole in the snow, all of them walking out alive at the end. And the men who died fastest over and over in the record were the ones with no one, the hired teamsters, the single, young men, strong, capable, and alone. If there is a reason this story has stayed in the American memory for nearly 2 centuries, I do not think it is really the horror. I think it is that. It is the discovery, made in the worst possible laboratory, that human beings are not built to survive by themselves, and that the thing that carries a person through an impossible winter is usually another person. The 2 Miwok men, Luis and Salvador, came into those mountains for people they did not know. Charles Stanton, who had no family in that company at all, rode back over a pass he had already safely crossed twice, because there were strangers up there who were hungry, and he died in the snow for it. The men of the relief parties walked into the Sierra Nevada in February on foot, for wages that were not remotely worth it. James Reed, thrown out of the company and left to die, came back over the mountains for the people who had thrown him out. Every genuinely admirable thing in this story is somebody going toward other people, when there was no reason to, so let the rest of it settle now. Let Lansford Hastings and his book fade out. Let the arguments about who did what in the last weeks fade out too, because they were settled long ago by people who are not there and cannot be settled now by us. What stays is a lake in the mountains, and it is still there, and it is beautiful. The pines still come down to the water. The pass is still above it, and there is a road over it now, and in winter the ploughs keep it open, and people drive over the exact ground where those families turned back listening to music, thinking about nothing in particular, taking about 4 minutes to cross a distance that once took 4 months to fail at. That is not sad, I think. That is what we build roads for. The whole point of all that suffering in the end was that eventually nobody would have to suffer it. If this long walk through the dark was worth taking, you can tap the like button gently, as a quiet signal that you would like more nights like this one. And if you would like to keep travelling with me through the buried undersides of the stories we think we already know, you might subscribe, and I will keep finding them and bringing them to you in the dark. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me once more where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what the weather is doing outside your window. Rain, or snow, or a warm night with the window open. Because that was the whole difference in the end for those families. A few days of weather, nothing more than that. So, rest now. You're warm, and you're fed, and you're safe, and none of that is nothing. The snow up there melted 170-odd winters ago. The people came down out of the mountains, or they did not, and either way their part is finished and there is nothing left for you to worry about on their behalf. Let the mountains keep their long white silence. Let the lake be green and quiet in the summer sun. Let those families rest, all of them, the ones who walked out and the ones who did not. Sleep well. The road is open now. It has been open for a very long time.